The ocean was quiet that morning, too quiet for a world at war. A thin veil of fog drifted above the water like a pale curtain, soft and silent, hiding the horizon. Beneath it lay a scattered fleet, steel giants resting on still water, exhausted, wounded, and breathless. Their metal hulls, once symbols of unstoppable power, now looked strangely vulnerable. Some leaned slightly to one side, fighting to stay upright. Others exhaled faint trails of smoke that curled into the sky like weary sighs. And within this floating graveyard of metal and ambition, there was a man in oil-stained overalls, tightening the strap of his toolkit as the sun barely pierced the gray clouds overhead. They called him many things. Some said he was quiet. Some said he worked too slowly. Most said he was just a mechanic. But this was the morning everything would change, though no one, not even he, knew it yet. He stepped across the narrow walkway between two ships, feeling the dull vibration of dying engines beneath his boots. The air smelled of burnt fuel, rust, and cold ocean air. Somewhere in the distance, alarms wailed in short bursts, mechanical cries for help from machines that were barely clinging to life. The war had not been kind to this fleet. Months of relentless pressure, rushed repairs, and dwindling supplies had left them fractured and frail. Yet for now the sea still held its breath. He moved slowly, inspecting each engine he passed like a doctor feeling for a pulse. He listened to the metallic tremors with an instinct born from years of working unseen and often unappreciated. A soft rattle here. A delayed ignition there. A vibration so subtle most would miss it, and yet he heard it as clearly as one hears the distant warning of thunder. Perhaps this was where everything truly began, in the quiet. A mechanic, nothing more, walking into a storm that had not yet announced itself. He was not a hero. Not in the traditional sense. No medals. No speeches. No rank that commanded attention. Just a man with a wrench hanging from his belt and a mind that understood machines better than people. But history has a peculiar habit of turning ordinary people into its central characters, often without their consent. He reached the main engineering deck of the largest ship, a vessel so massive it cast a shadow over the smaller ones nearby. Its engines were legends in their own time, but legends too can bleed. And right now they were bleeding badly. He crouched near a damaged panel, ran his fingers along the dented metal and inhaled deeply. The smell of overheated circuits drifted into the cold morning air. Something was wrong. Not broken. Not damaged. Wrong. A deeper kind of wrongness that doesn't come from battle but from design. He paused, closing his eyes briefly, letting the subtle hum of the machinery wash over him. When he opened them again, a faint crease formed between his brows. He didn't say anything. He rarely did. But that crease, that quiet recognition, was the first sign that the story was already in motion. And beyond the fog, far beyond the horizon, the world was preparing for a blow that would soon fall with unforgiving force. For now, though, only he sensed the danger. Not because he was special, but because he listened. Machines spoke to him in ways people never could. He continued his inspection, stepping deeper into the belly of the vessel. The steel corridors narrowed, the air thickened with heat, and the distant thrum of malfunctioning pistons echoed like a heartbeat losing its rhythm. He touched the walls as he walked, feeling for vibrations, mapping the ship by instinct. He reached the core engine chamber, an enormous space filled with towers of circuitry, pipes, turbine housings, control valves, and countless mechanical arteries twisting like metal veins. The sound here was overwhelming, a chaotic chorus of grinding, clanking, misfiring, and struggling gears. It was as if the ship itself was begging for relief. He whispered under his breath, barely audible, "Hold on, just a little longer." No one heard the words. No one would remember them. But in the hours to come, that quiet promise would echo far louder than he ever intended. He kneeled beside the primary regulator, a massive cylindrical unit that controlled the engine's power distribution. It was flickering irregularly, its internal mechanisms fighting to synchronize. He placed his hand on it, feeling the rapid pulse of metal on the verge of failure. This wasn't a typical malfunction. Something deeper was unraveling. He opened the casing with slow, deliberate movements. Inside, wires lay melted, cross-connected, or bent at unnatural angles. But despite the damage, something puzzled him. The pattern of the failure wasn't random. It was systematic, predictable, intentional. He exhaled sharply, a thin cloud of breath forming in the cooler air of the chamber. Someone had tampered with it. A saboteur? A mistake in the original design? A flaw no one had noticed until it was already too late? He didn't know. Not yet. But he knew this: the fleet was living on borrowed time. As he inspected the damage, footsteps echoed from behind. The heavy boots of an officer approached, carrying authority with each step. The mechanic did not turn immediately. He continued to examine the circuitry as if the world outside his focus didn't exist. The officer's voice cut sharply through the chamber. "What's the status?" No greeting. No warmth. Not even a hint of respect. The mechanic responded quietly, "There's a major fault in the regulator." The officer scoffed. "We know that. The question is, how long until it's fixed?" He didn't answer right away. He simply stared deeper into the machinery, calculating in his mind, tracing pathways, analyzing the damage. At last he spoke. "It's not just damage. Something's wrong with the core alignment." "It might be." "Just fix it," the officer snapped. "We don't have time for theories." Then he walked away, leaving the mechanic alone with the dying engine. The mechanic's jaw tightened, not in anger but in resignation. He had been through this before. People listened when machines ran well. When they didn't, he became invisible again. Or worse, an inconvenience. He wiped his hands on his overalls and reached deeper into the regulator. His fingers traced the wires, noting the inconsistencies. This wasn't a fault created by war alone. It had been growing for months, a structural flaw waiting for the right moment to collapse. And unfortunately, that moment was now. He began working silently, carefully, removing burned components, replacing damaged connectors, rewiring circuits. Every movement was deliberate, precise, as if each action had been rehearsed 1,000 times in his mind. Outside, the fog thickened. The horizon disappeared completely. And somewhere far beyond it, the first signs of an approaching enemy stirred. But here inside the ship, inside the last line of defense, inside a machine slowly losing its will to fight, one man worked alone. There were no cameras on him. No admirals watching. No glory waiting. Just the relentless rhythm of failing machinery, and the stubborn resolve of a man who refused to give up. He paused to catch his breath. Sweat trickled down his neck despite the cold engine room. He adjusted a valve, tightened 2 bolts, reconnected a coolant line. And slowly, very slowly, the pulse of the engine began to even out. Not fixed. Not safe. But stable enough to breathe again. He leaned back and closed his eyes briefly. This was far from over. Beyond the hull of the ship, a faint rumble rolled across the water. A distant thunder that did not come from the sky. He recognized the sound instantly. Engines. Enemy engines. He stood up, wiping grease from his hands. War was coming sooner than expected. And the fleet was nowhere near ready. He grabbed his toolkit again and moved deeper into the corridors. Every second mattered. And though he didn't know it yet, the next hours would force him into a battle not of guns and armor, but of gears and bolts, logic and instinct, fear and determination. A battle where a single mistake would doom thousands. A battle where the fate of a nation would hinge not on admirals or commanders, but on him. But for now he walked quietly, unrecognized, unseen. Just a mechanic. And yet, within him, history waited patiently for its moment to awaken. The fog thickened over the water until the fleet appeared suspended in a gray void, a ghostly archipelago of steel drifting between worlds. The hulls sat still, but inside them, life pulsed restlessly. Crews hurried along walkways, engineers shouted readings to one another, officers exchanged stiff words under the weight of responsibility. Yet beneath the surface of all that visible activity, there was something quieter, something heavier, something the men could feel even if they didn't fully understand it. Machines were failing faster than they could be repaired. Somewhere in the officer's deck, maps lay scattered across a table. Circles drawn in red indicated enemy movement. Arrows curved around supply lines. A handful of anxious strategists whispered calculations and predictions like gamblers attempting to read a doomed game. The fleet was not merely a line of defense. It was the last wall between their homeland and an enemy who believed in overwhelming force. And somewhere in the back of every mind was a truth no one wanted to voice aloud. If these ships failed, everything else would fall. The war had been building for years, but the current month, this single stretch of days, had carved itself into legend even before its story was complete. Tensions had escalated across multiple territories. Alliances collided like tectonic plates. Political miscalculations, diplomatic failures, and a chain reaction of aggression had pulled nations into a conflict they were no longer capable of escaping. But for the men aboard this fleet, history wasn't something written in books or discussed in hushed tones in government halls. For them, history was metal. It was fuel. It was pressure gauges and sonar readings and engines that had to keep beating no matter what. And right now, that heart was skipping too many beats. Far below, the mechanic continued walking through the belly of the ship. The deeper he moved, the more the environment changed. The warmth of the upper decks gave way to oppressive heat from the machinery. Metal beams vibrated with low-frequency groans. Pipes sweated condensation onto the floor. The lights flickered in erratic rhythms, brief moments of darkness punctuating the mechanical chorus. He knew each sound intimately, like a conductor who could recognize a single dissonant note in an orchestra of hundreds. The rhythm today was off. Too many inconsistencies. Too many systems running hotter than they should. He paused at a junction of coolant pipes, placed his hand on one and felt the uneven flow. Something was choking the system. He leaned closer, listening. There was again, a pulse, a backlash of pressure every few seconds. It was faint but unmistakable. A sign that the problem spread deeper than the regulator alone. The ship wasn't just suffering. It was deteriorating from within. He knelt, removed a panel and inspected the valves. A thin residue coated the inside, burnt, brittle and strangely patterned. Not war damage. Not corrosion. Something else. A flaw. A systemic flaw that would surface again and again if not corrected. He exhaled slowly. Machines kept their secrets well, but not from him. He wished, sometimes, that the people on the upper decks would listen to the warnings he gave years ago. Warnings about overloading systems, about maintenance schedules being shortened, about pushing the engines beyond their intended limits. But in war, time was a luxury. And so, little by little, a fault in the design had grown unnoticed, inching toward catastrophe. Above him, officers continued their debates. Maps were updated, intelligence briefings revised. They believed the greatest threat came from the enemy moving in the fog. But the mechanic knew the truth that no one else understood yet. The real danger was already inside the ship. He kept moving, each corridor revealing more signs of stress. Hairline fractures along welds, coolant drips that hinted at microleaks, wires that had overheated and cooled so rapidly they had grown brittle. It was a world of small, quiet failures, each one insignificant alone, but together forming a storm. He climbed a ladder to the auxiliary deck, where two junior engineers were arguing. One slammed a clipboard against a railing. "I'm telling you, it's not the intake valves." "It has to be," the other insisted. "Nothing else explains the power drop." "You're both wrong," the mechanic said quietly as he passed. They stared at him, confused, almost offended. "What?" one of them demanded. He pointed at a gauge above their heads. "The pressure imbalance isn't coming from the intakes. It's coming from the rear crossfeed. If you don't correct it soon, it'll overload the primary pump." They hesitated, looked at each other, then back at him. "How do you know?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. They rushed to check the crossfeed. 3 seconds later, one shouted, "He's right." But the mechanic was already walking away. He had seen enough. The fleet was crumbling, slowly, silently, invisibly. But if he could see it, then the consequences were closer than anyone imagined. On the upper bridge, the fleet commander stood at the wide observation window. His hands tightened behind his back as he studied the fog-shrouded horizon. He had commanded ships for decades, sailed through storms, survived ambushes, lost friends, and watched enemies turn to ash under naval fire. Yet today felt different, heavier. He didn't trust the weather. He didn't trust the silence. And more importantly, he didn't trust the engines. A lieutenant approached him. "Sir, reconnaissance reports enemy movement. They're approaching faster than expected." The commander didn't turn. "How long until they're within striking range?" "For hours, maybe less." A grim pause followed. "And our engines?" the commander asked. The lieutenant swallowed. "Not stable, sir. Engineering is doing what they can." "Doing what they can," the commander murmured. Behind those simple words lay a truth every leader feared, depending on the fragile miracles of men in lower decks who rarely received thanks. The fog parted briefly as a breeze pushed through. A sliver of the water became visible, just enough to glimpse a distant line of shapes emerging on the edge of the world. Enemy ships. Not many. Not yet. But scouts always came first. The mechanic did not see them. But he felt the tension in the air. The way the ship vibrated more nervously. The way officers' voices had grown sharper. The way rumors whispered through corridors like wind slipping through broken windows. War was a living thing and the fleet could feel its breath. He stopped near a set of bulkhead doors and leaned against them, listening to the low-frequency hum that reverberated through the metal. That hum was the fleet's heartbeat. It should have been steady, strong, predictable. But it wasn't. It fluttered, stuttered, missed notes. He closed his eyes, isolating individual patterns of vibration. The failures were spreading. Not outward from a single source but inward, converging on a central issue. A problem rooted in the design itself. A weakness that had been present since the construction of the engines, ignored, unaddressed, waiting like a dormant fault line. Perhaps this was always how disasters began, not with explosions or alarms, but with small vibrations no one else noticed. The first shiver before the earthquake. He pushed the doors open and entered the main distribution chamber. A massive space filled with pulsating conduits, glowing control rods and circulating coolant loops. The heat was unbearable. Sweat collected on his forehead, rolled down his face and disappeared into his collar. He walked deeper, his boots clanking against the steel grating. Each step brought him closer to the center, closer to the truth. At the heart of the chamber, he knelt beside a diagnostic panel. He connected a handheld device to the system. Lines of data scrolled rapidly across its screen. Pressure curves. Temperature spikes. Flow fluctuations. Then he saw it. A pattern. A single recurring anomaly that had been overlooked because it appeared random, except it wasn't. It followed a precise interval. A mathematical rhythm. A pulse. His eyes widened. He leaned closer to the display, tracing the pattern with his finger. It was unmistakable, a misalignment in the power grid. A microscopic shift in the distribution framework that compounded with every surge. Over weeks it would weaken. Over months it would destabilize. And under the enormous pressure of wartime strain, it would collapse entirely. Now he understood why the regulator burned out. Why the coolant pumps grew unstable. Why the engines groaned like dying beasts. This wasn't mismanagement. This wasn't sabotage. This was a birth defect. A flaw in the very architecture of the fleet. A flaw no one had ever seen, because no one listened as closely to the machines as he did. He sat back, stunned by the weight of the discovery. The fleet wasn't failing because war had wounded it. It was failing because it had been built imperfectly. Designed with an oversight so small that only years of strain had revealed it. He whispered to himself, "This changes everything." Above him, unaware of the revelation blooming in the depths, the officers argued over strategy. Should they advance? Should they retreat? Should they hold position? Should they call for reinforcements? None of those decisions mattered if the engines died. The mechanic stood and exhaled slowly. The heat of the chamber pressed against him like a living creature. He wiped his hands and walked toward the exit. He knew what he had to do. He had to reach the commander. He climbed the ladders, passed through narrow corridors and emerged into the mid-level decks. The closer he got to the upper bridge, the cleaner the air seemed. The uniforms looked sharper. The voices sounded more confident. Yet none of them felt what he felt in the steel, None sensed the approaching collapse. He reached the bridge entrance. 2 guards stopped him. "You can't enter," one said. "I need to speak with the commander," the mechanic replied calmly. "About what?" "The engines," he said. "There's a flaw in the grid. A serious one. Fui. No one gets in without clearance." He tried again. "If I don't speak with him, this fleet will step back." Their tone was cold, final. He lowered his gaze. Not in fear, but in frustration. This was why warnings went unheard. This was why problems became disasters. Hierarchy. Bureaucracy. People who spoke louder always drowned out people who understood more. He stepped aside. The guards returned to their positions. He walked away. But he didn't stop. If he couldn't warn the commander, he'd fix it himself. He made his way back down to the engineering decks, his mind racing with calculations. The flaw was complicated, more complicated than any standard repair. It wasn't a matter of replacing a part or patching a leak. This required realignment of the distribution grid, recalibration of the power converters, and synchronization of multiple subsystems that had never been designed to sync. It would be delicate. It would be dangerous. And most importantly, it would be irreversible. If he tried, there was a chance he would destroy the engines completely. If he didn't, they would fail anyway. A choice between a risky salvation or a guaranteed downfall. He reached the lower decks just as a tremor shook the ship. A sudden vibration rippled through the metal. Warning lights flickered. A low alarm sounded. He broke into a run. Another tremor followed, stronger, deeper. The engine was slipping, losing its rhythm. The flaw was accelerating. The ship sensed the enemy approaching. And machines, like people, sometimes panicked when pushed too far. He entered the core chamber again. The heat had intensified. Panels glowed dangerously. Pressure valves hissed with sharp bursts of steam. The ship was burning itself alive. He knelt beside the primary distribution manifold. It was vibrating violently. Bolts loosened. Connections strained. He grabbed his tools. This was it. The moment history would remember. Though no one knew his name. Though no one believed him. Though no one saw him. He worked quickly, hands steady despite the chaos around him. He opened the manifold, revealing a complex web of conduits and power channels. The air shimmered with heat. Static crackled against his skin. The lights flickered. Sweat dripped into his eyes, but he didn't stop. He reached into the machinery, adjusting alignment rods, recalibrating mechanisms, tightening conductive screws. Each action required absolute precision. A fraction of a millimeter off and the system would collapse. The chamber shook again. Above him, distant alarms signaled that the enemy had entered firing range. He kept working. The engines groaned. He worked faster. The ship trembled violently. Sparks shot from a nearby conduit, lighting the chamber in brief flashes of white-blue brilliance. Then, silence. He froze. The engine's chaotic pulse went still. A moment of dread washed over him. Then a deep, steady hum rose from the core. He opened his eyes. The engine was stabilizing. The flaw was correcting. The ship was breathing again. He exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. But above deck, none of this was known. The officers saw only one thing. Enemy ships approaching through the fog. But what they couldn't see was that the man they dismissed, the man they ignored, the man they believed to be just a mechanic, had just saved their lives. And the battle had not even begun. The ship shook again, but this time the vibration felt different. It wasn't the uneasy, dying rumble from before. It was stronger, more balanced, like a heartbeat finding its rhythm again after coming close to stopping. Deep inside the lower decks, the mechanic leaned back against the hot metal wall. His hands trembled slightly. Not from fear, but from exhaustion. The repair he had just finished was the hardest thing he had ever attempted. Harder than anything he had trained for. Harder than anything he thought he would ever dare to try. For a few seconds he simply breathed. Slow, steady breaths. The air was thick and hot, filled with the smell of oil and burning metal. Sweat rolled down his face and dripped from his chin, hitting the ground with soft taps that echoed in the quiet room. He had done it. He had saved the engine. But he didn't smile. He didn't cheer. He didn't even close his eyes. Because he knew something important. Fixing one ship wasn't enough. If the rest of the fleet had the same hidden flaw, they were all in danger. He pushed himself to his feet. His legs felt weak, but he forced them to move. He picked up his tool bag and walked toward the exit of the engine chamber. As he stepped back into the hallway, he heard the distant sound of crew members shouting orders. Heavy footsteps rushed down the corridors. Radios crackled with urgent messages. The battle was coming. And the fleet was nowhere near ready. He hurried up the stairs, his boots hitting the steel steps with quick, heavy thuds. When he reached the middeck, he saw sailors running in all directions, some carrying weapons, others loading supplies, and a few checking communication lines. The tension in the air was so thick it felt like walking through fog. He grabbed the arm of a young engineer rushing past him. "What's happening?" the mechanic asked. "They're close," the engineer gasped. "Enemy ships broke through the fog. Command says we're 20 minutes from combat range." The mechanic let go of the man's arm. His chest tightened. 20 minutes. Not nearly enough time. He stepped aside as a group of officers hurried past, speaking fast and sharp. "Engines are stable enough," one said. "For now," another replied. "But if they push too hard, we don't have a choice. We need full speed." Full speed. The mechanic felt a cold shock run through him. Full speed would put huge strain on the engines, strain they were not built to endure for long. The hidden flaw he discovered would spread. The machinery would heat, stretch, twist. And soon, very soon, it would break again. Unless someone fixed the source of the problem across the entire fleet. He walked quickly toward the communication room. It was his last chance to warn the commander. Maybe they wouldn't let him on the bridge, but someone here might listen. Inside the room, rows of radio operators sat with headphones on, sending and receiving messages at lightning speed. Static filled the air, mixed with short words and numbers spoken in tense voices. The mechanic approached one of the operators. "I need to send a message to the commander," he said firmly. The operator didn't look up. "Everyone needs to send a message. Please wait." "This is important," the mechanic insisted. "It's about the engines." "There." "Not now," the operator cut in. "We're preparing battle reports." The mechanic's jaw tightened. He stepped back. The room was too busy. Too loud. Nobody cared about engines right now. Not when enemy ships were charging through the fog like wolves spotting wounded prey. He turned and left the room. For a moment he stood still in the hallway, listening to the distant rumble of the ship's turbines as they began to spin faster. The entire floor vibrated softly beneath his feet. The fleet was preparing to move, and the enemy was drawing closer. He knew what he had to do. If the officers wouldn't listen, he would save the fleet himself. Even if it meant working alone. Even if it meant risking his life. Even if no one knew. He rushed toward the exit that led to the next ship. The walkway between the vessels swayed gently with the water's motion. Fog drifted past him, cool against his overheated skin. The sea was calm, but it felt like the calm before a storm that could swallow everything. As he crossed the walkway, he glanced up. The sky was heavy and gray. A large shadow moved behind the fog. Another ship from the fleet. A reminder that dozens of others depended on the same broken system he had just discovered. He worked quickly, moving from ship to ship, checking the critical areas he knew were most vulnerable. Every place he inspected showed the same signs: overheated lines, misaligned power feeds, trembling conduits. The flaw was everywhere. He felt a growing urgency inside his chest. He didn't have hours. He didn't have even 1 hour. He had minutes. By the time he reached the fourth ship, the fog began to thin. The sound of distant engines, stronger and deeper than the fleet's engines, rolled across the water. They didn't sound like waves. They sounded like metal beasts waking up. Enemy ships. He hurried inside the engine room of the fourth vessel. Engineers were already working there, but they looked lost. Confused. One of them held a charred piece of wiring, shaking his head. "It burned straight through," the young engineer said. "I've never seen anything like." "It's the power grid flaw," the mechanic said. "You're pushing too much current through a misaligned network." They stared at him blankly. "What does that mean?" one asked. It means, he answered, the engine will collapse in 10 minutes if we don't realign the system. Their eyes widened. We don't know how, one whispered. I do, the mechanic said. He knelt beside the control unit, opened the casing, and began the same risky, delicate adjustment he had performed on the flagship. Sparks shot up the moment he touched the alignment rods. One engineer flinched. Another stepped back. Don't touch anything, the mechanic warned. If you move one wire out of place, this entire ship will shut down. They watched him work, silent, tense, unsure, while he tightened bolts, readjusted conduits, and rebalanced the energy feed. The engine's violent shaking slowly faded. The pipes stopped rattling. The pressure stabilized. When he finished, he stood up and wiped his forehead. That'll hold, he said simply. A moment later, the radio on the wall buzzed to life. Enemy vessels sighted. All ships prepare for combat. The crew members froze. The mechanic didn't. He grabbed his bag again and rushed out. He still had more ships to save. As he ran along the walkway toward the next vessel, he finally saw them. The enemy. Dark shadows in the thinning fog. Long shapes. Sharp hulls cutting through the water like blades. Rows of cannons pointed forward. Engines roaring with power. They were close. Too close. The mechanic hurried across the metal walkway, his heart pounding. He reached the next ship and slid down the stairs into the engine bay. But before he could even open a panel, a violent blast shook the world. A distant explosion. Not on his ship, but close enough to rattle the entire fleet. He stumbled forward, grabbing a railing to keep from falling. A loud siren screamed across the decks. Radios erupted with shouts. Enemy has opened fire. All ships return fire. Brace for impact. The mechanic's breath caught in his throat. This was it. The battle had begun. And the engines of the fleet, these fragile, flawed hearts, were about to be pushed harder than ever. He had no time to think. He dove into the machinery and began his work, hands trembling but steady enough to do what needed to be done. Above him, the ship roared as its guns fired. The hull shook. Dust fell from the ceiling. Men yelled orders, ran across decks, and prepared for the fight of their lives. The mechanic didn't see the enemy shells that streaked overhead. He didn't see the flashes of fire on the horizon. He didn't see the commander shouting commands from the bridge. All he saw was the engine. All he heard was its uneven voice. All he cared about was keeping it alive. The ship trembled again, a deep, painful shudder. A warning. He worked faster, adjusting, tightening, realigning, cooling. Sweat dripped onto the metal. His hands burned from the heat of the components. Then, a deep, powerful hum rose within the engine. Stable. For now. He stood up, chest heaving. He had saved another ship. But the battle outside was growing worse by the second. The fog was almost gone now. The enemy fleet was visible, large, dark, and deadly. Cannon fire lit the sky in bursts of orange and white. The mechanic forced himself to move again. One more ship. Then another. Then another. He became a blur of motion, crossing walkways, ducking explosions, sliding into engine rooms, and saving ship after ship with bare hands and raw instinct. Nobody had time to stop him. Nobody had time to question him. They hardly even noticed him. But he kept going. Because he knew the truth. If even one ship fell out of formation during the battle, the entire fleet would collapse inward like a chain reaction. He felt the danger rising. Each engine room told the same story: overworked systems, failing components, looming disaster. The flaw he discovered was pushing every ship to the edge. And he was the only one who understood how close they were to losing everything. He reached his 8th ship. By now the sky was filled with smoke. The sea shook with the force of cannons. Alarms rang everywhere. At one point, a shell exploded so close that the walkway he was crossing shook violently, throwing him to his knees. He dragged himself back up and kept going. Inside the 8th engine room he saw something terrifying. A pipe had burst. Coolant sprayed across the room in a high-pressure mist. Steam filled the air. Engineers struggled to control the leak, slipping on the wet metal floor. "It's overheating," someone shouted. "We're losing control." The mechanic rushed forward. "Get back." The engineers backed away, fear on their faces. The mechanic approached the broken pipe, shielding his eyes from the steam. He grabbed a heavy wrench and twisted the emergency valve. The spray slowed, then stopped. But the engine was still boiling. He had to stabilize it fast. He worked as quickly as he could, patching the pipe, adjusting the coolant flow, resetting the pressure locks. One wrong move and the engine would explode. He felt the heat burning the skin on his arms, but he didn't stop. The crew watched him with wide eyes, unable to look away from the impossible task he was performing. Finally, the engine's violent shaking eased. The temperature dropped. The pressure normalized. The ship was safe. For now. He wiped his burned hands on his pants and staggered toward the exit. One of the young engineers grabbed his arm. "How are you doing all this?" the young man asked. "Who trained you?" The mechanic paused. "No one," he said softly. "I just listen." He stepped out of the room. Just then, another explosion rocked the sea. The ship he had just saved fired a full volley of its guns. Flames lit the sky. The enemy fleet was pushing harder, closing the distance, determined to break through. He knew what he had to do next. He had to reach the flagship one more time. Because if the enemy got too close, the final battle would come down to the largest ship in the fleet. And its engine was the most important one of all. He ran back across the walkways, coughing as smoke filled the air. Crew members shouted to one another. Sirens blared. The sea lit up with fire and gunshots. The smell of burning metal mixed with the salty ocean air. He reached the flagship's entrance. He stepped inside. And froze. The ship felt different. Quieter. Calmer. He hurried toward the engine room, confused. When he reached it, he saw the reason. The engine he had saved earlier, now glowing a steady, powerful blue, was running smoother than it ever had. His repair had held. Stronger than he thought. He stared at it, breathless. But the battle wasn't over. And he had one final task. He had to fix the flaw forever. Not just patch it. Not just slow it down. Not just delay it. Fix it. Completely. Even if it meant risking everything. He dropped his bag onto the floor and opened the main control panel. His hands burned. His lungs ached. His mind raced. But he wasn't afraid. He was ready. He leaned forward, tools in hand, and began the most dangerous repair of his life. A repair no one else understood. A repair no one else could even attempt. A repair that would decide the fate of every man, every ship, every life in the fleet. Outside, the battle raged louder than ever. Inside, a single man worked in silence. Just a mechanic. But today, history belonged to him. The engine room was hot enough to feel like a furnace. Pipes rattled. Valves hissed. The air shimmered from the heat. But the mechanic stood firm, his face lit by the soft, blue glow of the stabilized engine he had just saved. Now came the hardest part. He opened the command panel, its inside filled with a maze of wires, switches, and glowing circuits. The flaw he discovered earlier ran through this entire system like a spreading crack in glass. If he didn't fix it here, the same disaster would rise again. He touched one of the alignment rods. It was hot, so hot it burned his fingertips. He didn't move his hand away. Pain didn't matter. Lives did. Outside, enemy ships closed in. Their cannons thundered across the water, shaking the fleet. Explosions filled the air with fire and smoke. Shouts echoed through the decks. But down here, the world felt smaller. Just him. The engine. And the ticking clock of a battle happening above his head. He bent down and began to remove damaged modules. Sparks flew as he pulled one out. The ship jerked. Something exploded above him. Dust rained down from the ceiling. He kept working. He replaced burnt wires, reconnected conduits, and checked each route of the power flow. His hands moved fast but precisely, like a musician who knew every note of a difficult song. He could almost hear the engine speaking to him, telling him when it hurt, where it struggled, which pieces needed help. After several minutes, he stopped suddenly. He found it. The core flaw. A power loop buried deep inside the system, invisible to most engineers. It fed too much current into the wrong pathway. During normal days it didn't cause trouble. But during high pressure, like today, it pushed the engine toward collapse. He whispered to himself, "There you are. Now came the hardest part. To fix this flaw, he had to disconnect the main power lines. Doing that would shut the engine off completely. And if the engine shut off, the flagship would stop moving. And if the flagship stopped moving, the enemy would destroy it first. He closed his eyes for a moment. He heard the distant rumble of cannons, the sharp sound of another explosion, the shouting of officers, the panic in the voices of sailors running across the deck. Time was nearly gone. He opened his eyes. He had made his choice. He reached into the panel, grabbed the main power cable and pulled it free. The engine let out a long, deep groan, and then went silent. The lights in the room flickered. The floor stopped vibrating. The ship's heartbeat had stopped. Above him, alarms began to scream. Voices shouted orders. What happened? Power's dropping. Main engine offline. We're sitting ducks out here. The mechanic heard none of it. He was already working. He had seconds, maybe less. He cut wires, stripped them, reshaped them, rewired them, reconnected them. He tightened bolts with burned fingers. Sweat dripped from his face and hit the glowing circuits. The air smelled of hot metal and smoke. He was inside the core now, fighting against the flaw that had nearly doomed the fleet. Outside, the enemy saw the flagship slow down. Cannons pointed toward it. The enemy captain gave the command. Fire. A shell roared through the air. It hit the water near the flagship. The ship rocked violently. The mechanic stumbled, hit the wall but didn't stop. He crawled forward, reached the final alignment rod and plugged it into the corrected power grid. The engine flickered. He twisted the rod into place with both hands. Then, a burst of light filled the engine room. The engine roared back to life. The ship surged forward. Crew members shouted in shock and relief. Engine restored. We're moving again. What happened down there? But down in the engine room, the mechanic didn't celebrate. He simply exhaled and leaned against the wall. He wasn't finished. He climbed a ladder to reach the secondary grid. He opened another panel and scanned the readings. The engine was running smoother now, better than before. Stronger. Cleaner. He had fixed the flaw. Not temporarily. Not partly. Completely. The fleet could now push at full speed. Could fight back. It could survive. He allowed himself one small smile before grabbing his bag and walking out again. He had other ships to check. But as soon as he stepped out of the engine room, an officer stormed toward him. You, the officer barked. What did you do? The mechanic blinked. I repaired the engine, he said. You shut it down during battle. I had to. The grid was failing. You could have gotten us all killed. The officer was angry, shaking angry. But before the mechanic could respond, another figure walked forward. A figure with calm eyes and a steady presence. The fleet commander. Is this the man? The commander asked quietly. The officer stiffened. Yes, sir. He shut down the main engine without authorization. The commander stared at the mechanic. The mechanic stood still, unsure if he should salute or speak or simply fade into the background like he always did. Then the commander asked, You fixed the flaw, didn't you? The mechanic hesitated. Yes, sir. The commander nodded slowly. Good, he said. Follow me. The officer's jaw dropped. He stepped aside. For the first time in his life, the mechanic walked across the upper deck next to the commander. Crew members stared at him as he passed. Some looked confused. Others looked curious. A few looked grateful. He reached the bridge. Windows stretched from floor to ceiling. Smoke rose from the horizon. The enemy fleet continued to fire, but now the flagship moved with renewed strength, cutting through the waves. The commander turned to him. You saw something no one else did, he said. You understood something our entire engineering corps missed. I want to know everything. The mechanic spoke slowly, explaining the flaw in simple terms. His voice was quiet. His sentences were short. But every word carried weight. The commander listened. Really listened. When the mechanic finished, the commander took a deep breath. You didn't just save one ship, the commander said. You saved every ship out there. The mechanic lowered his eyes. I just did my job, sir. No, the commander replied softly. You did far more. A radio operator suddenly shouted, "Commander, the enemy is turning. They're falling back." Another crewman pressed his eye to the binoculars. "They're retreating. They're actually retreating." The fleet held its breath. Then came the roar of celebration. Officers shouting commands with energy. Sailors hugging each other. Radio men sending messages of victory. The entire ship shook with cheering. But through all the chaos, the mechanic stayed quiet. He stepped back from the windows. The battle was over. And the fleet survived. Not because of a powerful admiral. Not because of a famous hero. Not because of a brilliant plan. But because of a man no one looked at twice. A man with burned hands and a quiet mind. A man who listened to machines. A man who fixed what no one else could even see. Hours passed. The sky slowly cleared. The sun broke through the clouds. The ocean calmed. The fleet gathered again in formation, many ships damaged but all still afloat. The mechanic walked alone along the deck. The smell of gunpowder lingered. The water glistened with sunlight. The metal beneath his boots was warm, humming with the steady vibration of engines he had saved. Some sailors nodded at him as he passed. A few smiled. One or two saluted. It felt strange. He wasn't used to being noticed. He walked to the edge of the ship and rested his hands on the railing. The wind brushed against his face. Far in the distance, he saw smoke rising from the enemy's retreat path. Another battle would come one day. That was the nature of war. But today they lived. Footsteps approached behind him. He didn't turn. The commander stopped beside him. "You know," the commander said, "I've led ships for 30 years. I've studied battles, tactics, strategies. But today I learned something new." The mechanic looked at him quietly. "What did you learn, sir?" "That sometimes," the commander said, "the greatest battles are not fought on the bridge, but down there." He pointed to the lower decks. To the people nobody sees. The ones who hold everything together. The mechanic didn't answer. He just looked out at the ocean. The commander continued, "You saved more lives than any man on this ship today. When we return home, people should know that." The mechanic shook his head gently. "No, sir. They don't need to know." The commander raised an eyebrow. "Why not?" The mechanic smiled faintly. "Because machines don't ask for credit," he said softly. "And I'm just a mechanic." The commander watched him for a moment. Then, with a small smile of respect, he walked away. The mechanic stayed at the railing, feeling the sun warm his skin. The sea stretched endlessly before him, blue, calm, peaceful. A world that almost ended today. He closed his eyes. Maybe one day someone would tell his story. Maybe one day someone would understand what he did. Maybe one day history would remember. But even if it didn't, he would still wake up tomorrow. He would still tighten his toolkit strap. He would still walk through the humming steel corridors. He would still listen to the quiet voices of engines. Because that was who he was. Not a hero. Not a legend. Not a commander. Just a mechanic. A man who loved machines. A man who understood their language. A man who, on one unforgettable day, saved an entire fleet. And the ocean, calm once again, carried the fleet toward the horizon, toward home, toward tomorrow, with the steady heartbeat of engines that he had brought back to life.